Let's dive right into today's explainer, because we're looking at a deeply haunting, completely unresolved mystery. It's the kind of case that absolutely shook an entire nation to its core, and honestly, decades later, it still leaves us with way more questions than answers. But to truly grasp the weight of this story, we need to start with a highly relatable, pretty terrifying moment.
I want you to picture this. Imagine you're coming home from a long, exhausting business trip. You land at the airport, you grab a cab, and finally, you're stepping up to unlock your front door. You call out to your family, totally expecting that usual warm greeting, you know? But instead, there's just complete silence. I mean, raise your hand, metaphorically obviously, if you've ever left your family home alone and felt that tiny, irrational flicker of worry, that brief what if, that you immediately just kind of push away.
Well, this was the exact nightmare that businessman Lauro Vizconde stepped right into. The lights were on, but nobody answered. That universal flicker of worry we all push away, for Lauro, it became his actual reality. His life, as he knew it, literally ended right there in the doorway, even though he was still breathing.
Section 1, June 30th, 1991, Parañaque, Metro Manila, Philippines.
So this was a quiet, supposedly incredibly safe residential street, the kind of place where you honestly wouldn't think twice about locking your doors and going to sleep. It was just a completely normal Tuesday night. Lauro had traveled to the U.S. for work, leaving behind his loving family in that locked house. You had his wife, Estrellita, who was 45, their eldest daughter, Carmela, a really bright 19-year-old college student, and then there was Jennifer. I really want you to deliberately pause for a second here. Picture a 7-year-old child in your life, maybe a niece, a nephew, or a neighbor's kid. Because that was Jennifer. She was just 7 years old, barely in the second grade. When Lauro's family was found the next morning, investigators counted the total number of stab wounds inflicted on the three of them. 49.
And what is utterly horrific here is how those wounds were distributed. Estrellita was stabbed 13 times, Carmela 17 times, and she was sexually assaulted. And Jennifer, the 7-year-old child, she received 19 wounds. The youngest child received the most wounds. It's a fact that just stops you cold, and we aren't going to try to dress it up. The reality speaks for itself.
But here's the crucial detail that makes this even more baffling. When investigators arrived at the house, they found absolutely zero signs of forced entry. None. No broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no scratched locks, which means whoever entered that house either had a key, was invited in by someone the family trusted, or was a highly skilled professional who left absolutely no trace behind. You have to ask yourself, which of those three options terrifies you the most?
Section 2. 4 years of silence. The search for a suspect.
For 4 agonizing years, this case went essentially nowhere, and it totally paralyzed the country with fear. It completely shattered the illusion that middle-class families were safe behind their locked doors. Suddenly, people were double-checking their locks, calling their kids constantly. The Vizconde case became the ultimate, terrifying proof that nowhere was truly safe. But then, in the late 1990s, we hit an explosive turning point. A group of wealthy young men were accused of the murders. And the most prominent name on that list? Hubert Webb. He was the wealthy son of a really famous sitting senator and former basketball star. The second his name was dropped, the entire trajectory of the investigation shifted, and the media just descended.
To kind of translate the cultural weight of this case, for those of us familiar with American true crime, you really have to think of the O.J. Simpson trial, or even the West Memphis 3. You've got this wealthy, highly connected defendant, you have a massive, absolute media frenzy, and you've got a nation completely divided on whether the justice system can ever actually be trusted to get it right when immense power and money are thrown into the mix.
Let's look at the core conflict of the trial, because it builds this literally impossible contradiction. On one side, Hubert Webb had U.S. immigration records, travel documents, and witnesses proving he was physically in America during the murders. But on the other side, the prosecution brings out this star witness, a woman named Jessica Alfaro, who swore under oath that she saw him at the crime scene in the Philippines. I mean, one of these realities had to be a total lie.
Tracing the agonizing chronological passing of 3 decades is wild. Look at this timeline. In 2000, which is 9 years after the murders, Webb and his co-accused were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Half the country finally exhaled in relief, while the other half was screaming that the whole thing was a setup. But then, a full 10 years later, in 2010, the Philippine Supreme Court totally reversed the decision. And this brings us to a really terrifying legal reality. The Supreme Court found the eyewitness, Jessica Alfaro, to be unreliable, and they acquitted Webb.
Now, an acquittal just means the prosecution didn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It does not mean someone else was charged. It means that officially, legally, nobody killed the Vizconde family. The real killer was never actually found.
Section 3. The Open Wound. 34 years later.
When that 2010 ruling came down, Lauro Vizconde stood right outside the Supreme Court and wept. He had spent 19 years believing he had justice for his family, and then it was just wiped away. He was left with this immense, crushing grief and absolutely nowhere to put it, because the system ultimately provided zero closure. This feeling of injustice is exactly why this case haunts us. We watch explainers like this to understand if justice actually exists in the world. And here, we're left with the terrifying realization that a justice system can technically follow all of its own rules, process the evidence exactly as it's designed to, while completely and utterly failing the victims. Some cases have endings. Some cases just stop.
So the most crucial takeaway is that we are left with 3 incredibly haunting questions. Let's look at the first one. How did someone get past a locked door? We are still left with the terrifying, unsolved logistics of how a killer or killers entered a perfectly safe, locked family home without leaving a single trace of forced entry. It completely defies logic.
Question 2. Was Jessica Alfaro telling the truth or lying under pressure? Was this eyewitness a brave truth-teller standing up to a powerful political family, or was she a manipulated asset used by authorities to quickly close a cold case that was becoming a huge embarrassment?
And the third, which is perhaps the most chilling question of all, if Hubert Webb didn't do it, who did? Remember, whoever inflicted those 49 stab wounds walked away. They evaded justice entirely, and they might still be out there right now, living a completely normal life.
Which leads us to the ultimate unresolved thought. What actually happened in that house on June 30th, 1991? Estrellita, Carmela, and little 7-year-old Jennifer lost their lives, and nobody has answered for it. The wound is still completely open. So what does your gut tell you about the evidence we've looked at today? I really encourage you to think about this and discuss the lack of justice in the comments. Because honestly, when the legal system stops, the conversation is all we have left. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you on the next one.